What was it like inside that courtroom as that sentence was read? It's such an emotional time for these survivors. There has been so much emotion leading up to this moment. What is it that the reaction was throughout that courtroom as that sentence was read?
Didn't really come as a surprise to me, given the fact that he, unusually enough, he was convicted of violations of the racketeering statute, what we commonly call the RICO statute, which carries enormous penalties. So it was no surprise to me.
So, Paul, as you pointed out, prosecutors were asking for 25 years. The judge issued a higher sentence than that. Why do you think that the prosecution didn't ask for a higher sentence, considering what you said? And how often does that happen, that the judge exceeds the prosecution's recommendations?
It does happen fairly frequently. You have to remember that judges sit there through the entire trial. They are, except for ruling on objections to evidence, they form their own impressions of the evidence, of the witnesses. They're staring at the defendants. And judges do have, even in the federal courts, much more so in the state courts, judges do have discretion to exceed what we call the sentencing guidelines. And this particular judge is not known as a harsh sentencer, but she's a very attentive judge. And she must have formed some very distinct reactions to Mr. Kelly's demeanor, his constant substitution of lawyers. I think that tended to cut against him. But again, the basic principle would be that she, the judge in the Kelly case, was applying that driving force of the racketeering statute, which was not an element in Ms. Maxwell's sentencing yesterday.
Well, Kelly has replaced his legal team since he was convicted. He is now represented by the same attorney who helped get Bill Cosby's conviction overturned. What does that suggest, Paul, about his strategy?
Well, his strategy seems to be all over the place. If you look at the docket sheet, which is publicly available, Kelly has substituted attorneys with great frequency. He has a right to do that. He did it. Certainly, if he believes that by bringing in new lawyers at this late date, just before the sentencing, he's throwing a Hail Mary pass, because the record is already set. The sentencing memoranda of both sides were already submitted, and the judge had probably already made her decision. Certainly, Kelly is going to appeal. Certainly, Ms. Maxwell will appeal. But the unfortunate part for both of them is that convictions in federal court are very infrequently reversed.
And speaking of federal court, Paul, Kelly is facing a separate federal trial in Chicago for child pornography and obstruction charges there. Now, that is expected to start in August. Is today's sentencing going to impact that trial at all?
It's an open question to me, quite frankly, Tanya, and I don't want to get overly technical. Kelly was acquitted by a state court on the charges for which he is now going to be tried in the federal court in Illinois. So, number one, I would have the issue as his lawyer of whether or not he was facing double jeopardy, in effect being tried twice for the same offense. And it may well be that given the sentence here in New York against Kelly, the proceeding in federal court in Illinois, in Chicago, may well disappear. I'm not making that prediction, but that does often happen.
Interesting.
Back on the situation here in New York, does R.Kelly have a route for an appeal? Do you see a basis for that, given the facts of the case?
Well, he he actually has. I'll put aside the pornographic element of all of this, which is horrendous. But as a technical matter, and I don't want to, hack in the weeds, I think he may have a stronger basis for an appeal of the racketeering conviction, because essential to establishing a racketeering conviction are a few elements. But in order to do that, you as the government have to show that the victim was damaged in his or her business or property. And it seems to me from the start, a glaring omission here has been the lack of an impact. Well, I don't doubt the suffering of these young women and now grown women, but significantly omitted from the proof was what were the money damages sustained by the victims. And Kelly may have a fairly strong argument along those lines, in which case the substance wouldn't be reversed, but the case might well be sent back for the government to have another try at establishing that critical element of loss of monetary or financial loss.
All right, Paul Batista, if you could stand by for one moment. We also want to bring in CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan, who is outside the courthouse with more on this. Hi, Jerika. Can you give us some color on what happened today inside the courthouse when the sentencing was read?
Well, we were possibly expecting to hear from R.Kelly, but in the end, his attorney said that her client would not be giving any statements, as you guys have just mentioned, those pending cases. But the judge started off by simply saying that the sentencing of another human being was probably the hardest thing that a judge has to do, but laid out what this sentencing was supposed to reflect. The sentence, she said, must reflect the seriousness of the crime, the act as a deterrent, and protect the public from future crimes. She mentioned a number of other things, but at the end, as you just mentioned, of course, if you're just joining us, R. Kelly sentenced to 30 years in prison. The federal prosecutors were asking for an excess of 25 years, so they got what they were looking for. Meanwhile, his defense team was hoping somewhere in the range of 10 years because they felt as though the punishment did not fit the crimes that he was convicted of. Again, we're hoping to hear from some of the victims who were inside today. We know that federal prosecutors are expected to come out and address the media. Something that I thought was very interesting, because we have heard from some of these victims before during the actual testimony. 45 witnesses were called at that time back in September during that 6-week trial. But what I thought was interesting was Faith Rogers, who we first actually interviewed a couple of years ago, and said that she got an STD and unknowingly from R. Kelly when she was 19 years old, went up before the court and talked directly to R. Kelly, talked about what he did to her. But then her father wanted to address him and said, literally, I want you to look at me man to man, father to father. And he talked about his own experience as a father being abused as a young child, and empathized with R. Kelly, and basically said, we could come here today and be angry and upset, but we forgive you. We have compassion for you, and we believe that there is forgiveness in all of this if you admit to what you did. But as you heard earlier, as I was listening to you all speaking to the attorney, R. Kelly did not admit any wrongdoing. He had nothing to say to the numerous victims today who gave victim impact statements. But again, the judge saying that this was not a case about sex, but that it was about violence, cruelty, and control.
Jerika, I'm wondering, and you touched on it there just a moment ago, but what was it like inside that courtroom as that sentence was read? It's such an emotional time for these survivors. There has been so much emotion leading up to this moment. What is it that the reaction was throughout that courtroom as that sentence was read?
You know, I didn't hear any of the people who testified before, and honestly, I was in the overflow room, so I couldn't get a good look at what, if any, there was an emotional reaction or anything. I didn't hear any sighs of relief or anyone say anything. But I think, without a doubt, having spoken to many of these women before, there is a sense of relief and finality at these sentencings. Obviously, it first happens when the person accused of these crimes is actually convicted, and that happened last year. But now here we are facing the day of sentencing, where these victims or survivors, if you will, get a chance to directly address the person that they say destroyed their lives and change the outcome of what they could have been, what they wanted to be, because of this man that they believe took advantage of them. So just to hear the emotion from them, it was intense. And again, I don't think any of us were expecting to hear from the father of somebody who was abused by R.Kelly.
Sure. Paul, if you're still there, I'm wondering if you could comment on what we just heard from Jerika, that, you know, R.Kelly showed no remorse. He had nothing to say to the victims or the family of the victims. I mean, how can that factor into, number one, the chance of an appeal, as we were discussing earlier, and number two, you know, any sort of early, obviously he has a long prison, term ahead of him, any sort of early release from prison?
This is a fascinating case study. I think that Ms. Maxwell's admission of guilt and remorse before she was actually sentenced may have alleviated her sentence to some degree. It was, in a way, an act of courage in a lifetime, and I'm speaking about Ms. Maxwell, that didn't demonstrate a lot of courage. That may have been helpful to her. Kelly's response doesn't surprise me, given the nature of the evidence that shows he was a man who was accustomed to brutality, accustomed to giving commands, and he was not going to, in his view, in his macho worldview, he wasn't going to grovel in front of a federal judge to get a lesser sentence. Had he shown some remorse? Had he looked the victims in the eye and shown some remorse? He may have gotten a 25-year sentence as opposed to a 30-year sentence.